So let's go ahead and get started. I'm David Iglesias, Director of the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. Thank you for coming tonight. You know, I'm not supposed to say this, but I will. He's my favorite speaker. I've been doing this for 11 years. I've had PhDs, JDs, MDs, whatever alphabet soup. This guy's yeah. Thanks for coming out. First, a show of hands. Number of MKs in this room. Raise your hand. There you go. A lot of MKs. So he's the director. Dr. Woodberry is the director of the Project on Religion and Economic Change, an associate research professor at Baylor, or as they say in Texas, Baylor. Most of his research analyzes the long-term social impact of missions and religious change in societies. How many of you read the Christianity Today article that came out a few years ago on the world that missionaries made?
No.
She wrote it.
She wrote it? Wow.
She did right there.
Thank you. That as an MK myself, I thought, finally, somebody has proven what I thought all along. Missions change things for the good. And Dr. Woodberry here had to put up a lot of grief, because when he pitched the idea to the staff, they didn't like it. And he put up with a lot of bad stuff, like legally actionable things. I'm not a lawyer, so licensed, so I can say things like that. His research appears in the American Sociological Review, Annual Review for Sociology, and elsewhere. He's earned 15 outstanding research awards. Let me just quickly tell you a story. I heard, I'm not sure if he told me this or someone else, I heard that when he pitched the idea of the positive effects of mission work, he was told, oh, the Academy's not going to like this. You're going to have to do twice the research. And he said, I'll do 3 times the research. And he did. This guy is a research ace. And I say that as somebody who hates legal research. So kudos to you, sir. His research has elicited extensive popular media coverage, including a feature-length documentary, 2 episodes in a TV series, article Christianity Today, which I mentioned, and The Economist. He's a 1987 Wheaton grad, Yahoo, and got his PhD at UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Woodberry, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Today I'm going to talk to you about 4,000 years of global history in about 45 minutes. That means I will leave out some of the details. There's a lot of historical research underneath it. You can ask about specific cases if you want. That's helpful, but you will miss some details and there'll be gaps if you are looking for a very detailed analysis of certain things. Now, I'm mostly going to talk to you about printing and its social impact. Printing, most scholars agree, is one of the most important inventions in human history. However, most people think technology caused these outcomes, or technology and economic background caused these outcomes. I will argue that we can't understand anything about it unless we pay attention to religion. Religion was crucial to the origin, spread, uses, economic viability, and consequences of printing. Now, a quick aside about causation. Some people view causation in different ways. If there are lots of different causes of something, we use statistics, probabilistic analysis. So if you're talking about, like, for example, on average, people who have more education have more income, you don't point to one person who's well-educated and poor or not well-educated and rich and say, oh, you've disproved the association. Because you're talking about mean differences. And of course there's some people over here and some people over there. But there's a mean differences because there's lots of different factors that lead into income. If you're talking about something where there's only one cause or very few causes, then we can talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. Then it becomes much less probabilistic and more concrete. Now, normally people, when they talk about historical arguments, they add scope conditions. So they say it only applies to these 5 countries or this small time period. When I'm talking about these arguments, when I was doing the historical work, I kept on going like, how far can we make these scope conditions go? And really wide, okay? So part of this project is to see how broad can we make these scope conditions go in this historical argument about religion and printing. Now, I'm also going to be talking about cultural causes. Some people, that makes people uncomfortable because people view culture as being soft and something that changes and something that's internally contradictory. But culture's like grammar. We speak English. English draws on multiple grammatical and spelling systems. There's contradictions within it, but we're following rules. Those rules may change, but they still constrict how we speak. The same, I would argue, is with culture. Now, how do we know what's inside people's heads? Well, in this case, I'm looking at concrete things, like printing presses. When do they start? Who starts them? Why? Newspapers, etc. Things that we can date and we can see even, and then we can use multiple indicators to see what we think is inside people's heads. Now, I'm also going to be talking about broad categories like Protestant, Catholic, Theravada Buddhist, Mahayana, etc. I realize these are fuzzy sets, and I realize applying the word religion to certain traditions is controversial. We can go into the details of that, but I will do that. I will also be using the modern country names, even though I know the historical stuff. It's easier in a broad audience. So, first, some background about religion and certain types of communication technology. One is writing systems. So the writing system that we use, and we look back historically, relates to sort of a cultural focus. So if we look at Orthodox societies, they have alphabets that are based on Greek, focusing on Constantinople. If we look at Western Christians, Catholics and Protestants, they have an alphabet that focuses on Latin, based in Rome. If we look at East Asian societies, historically they had writing systems that were based on classical Chinese or literary Sinitic. So a written language, which was never a spoken language, and was very different from how people spoke, even completely different languages, but they wrote in this system that focused on Confucian culture. If we look at what some people call the Sanskrit cosmopolis, but areas where Brahmins, high caste Hindus, had positions in courts, use the Brahmi script, even if they're Theravada Buddhist, those areas use a similar script. Or any place where Islam spread or conquered, they use an Arabic-based script. Okay, so it's all focusing on a particular type of thing, and even if people don't speak the language, they use this written system, which is often distinct from how people speak. We see a similar thing with book forms. So we often think, of course a book looks like this. Well, that's not true. This is the Christian book form. Okay, Christians pioneered this within the Roman world and spread it around the world, and then Christian-linked groups like Islam or Manichaeans spread that as well. Other groups used other book forms and resisted this book form for a very long period of time. And we think, oh, it's natural that this is an efficient use of how to use paper and how to construct things. But it wasn't historically. Now, I'm going to switch back to printing. There are three major waves of printing. Most people only think of one or two. The first wave of printing was about 2000 BC on clay. The second wave in East Asia on paper. And then the third wave in Europe, which most people are familiar with. So more than 2,000 years BC, people in Mesopotamia started to print the equivalent of a page of text on bricks. And then they used those bricks to build religious structures. They weren't for people to read, they were for the gods to read. And so then if you have 15 million copies of this, and you build a building out of it. Okay? It could have been used for books. This is what books look like. You could have printed those. They're on clay, but nobody did. Now, Greeks and Romans picked up this technology and they printed on bricks, but not books. And then the Greeks conquered Central Asia and Northwest India, and many of them converted to Buddhism. They passed on this technology, and it started to be used to print Dharani. So these magical Sanskrit sutras, but they're using wood blocks, the same type of technology. Some of them have still survived, and they're printing Dharani sutras. And this was all over the Buddhist world. So Malaysia, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, India. Okay? Now, sometime in around 700, a Chinese Buddhist translated those dharani, the sounds of them, using Chinese characters. You can't read this because it's just the sounds of the Sanskrit sutra, and printed them on paper. And that's when we think printing started. Okay? But these are identical texts as were being printed on clay all over. But they're printed on paper. What the real invention was printing books designed to read. Now, depending on the area, this took about 100 years or multiple hundreds of years. So all the earliest books were Buddhist. The earliest surviving books contain dharani. They contain these magical sutras, but they also have text about them. Okay, and then printing started in these brown areas. So Mahayana Buddhist societies, but also Confucian. And the earliest examples that survive are from Korea and Japan, but it possibly started in China. It's likely, but we don't have any examples from it. The earliest one is from Korea. And then as Buddhism spread, printing spread. So all these brown areas printed, and all these pink areas printed. These are Mahayana Buddhists and Confucian. These are Tantric Buddhists, like Tibetan Buddhists, Mongols, etc. They printed too, but there was a big difference between the printing in these two areas. Here, it got picked up by the Confucian exam system. You start to get secular printing, you get broader literacy. It's always elite. It's in literary Sinitic, so a language that is only for writing, not for speaking. Here, it remained entirely Buddhist, entirely religious, entirely merit-based. So nobody sold texts. There were no secular texts printed until the 20th century when Protestant missionaries print the first secular texts in these areas. Okay, so there's lots of different groups. Buddhist, if they're Tantric or Mahayana Buddhist, they printed. If they weren't in a Hindu area, so the Sanskrit cosmopolis. If they were Buddhist, doesn't matter on the type. If they're in the Hindu area, they didn't print. And no other groups printed. Now, this was not because other groups didn't know how. So, for example, the Uyghurs, which are in Western China, when they were a combination of Buddhist and Christian and Manichaean, they printed. And you can look, the script looks very much like Arabic. Both of them are based on Aramaic, including movable font type. But when they converted to Islam, they stopped. Mongols, same alphabet, just this way, following China. The Mongols, when they invaded Central Asia, the ones who became Buddhist printed, the ones who became Muslim didn't. Now, Muslims printed certain things. So they copied paper. They used woodblock printing and other things to print on cloth. They printed words on coins. They produced stamps. They printed amulets, so large segments from the Quran, and folded them up in pouches and put them around their neck. But not for people to read, for God to read. And they printed Hajj certificates. So if you go on the Hajj, you get these certificates. You can see this is pretty sophisticated printing. Multiple colors, so you have to have overlapping things, both positive and negative images. It's pretty complicated. Okay? They could have printed books. They didn't, including Muslims in China, where they're surrounded by printing. Same with Hindus. Hindus, these are from Hindu temples in China. This is from a pagoda Chinese pagoda that used to be in India, but it's no longer there. So you had plenty of contact and exposure where they could have printed, but they didn't. Now, if you want, later I won't get into the reasons of why I think this is, but I think there's some reasons why I think these religious differences mattered. Then we look at European printing. So roughly 1450, about 700 years after East Asians were printing on paper. This printing starts in Europe and it spreads to virtually all Christian and Jewish societies, including Christians and Jews in the Muslim world and in India. But nobody copies them. And it varies in terms of how it develops within Europe. So, Orthodox start to print in the 1400s, as do Catholics, but it gets locked mostly in Church Slavonic, the language of the liturgy, and very little growth in printing over time until the 20th century mostly, some in the 19th century. Catholics, you get a much more rapid spread of printing, including some printing in the vernacular. So it was faster spread and more vernacular with Catholic printing than any previous wave of printing. Okay, but it really takes off when you get the Protestant Reformation. And so I argue it created what's called what I'm calling like the vernacular revolution. because Protestants changed the idea of who books are for. Protestants wanted everyone to be able to read the Bible for themselves in the language of their heart. So you switch from the sacred language being a fixed language that people mostly don't speak, to the sacred language is whatever you speak. We need you to have the Bible in that language. Now, that transforms how printing is used. And there's all kinds of indicators of that which transform, I would argue, the world. We can see this effect in multiple ways. One, timing. So there's a big gap between when you get printing and when these effects happen. They happen faster in Protestant areas than other areas. There's also, you get the same technology in lots of places with different outcomes. You also see shifts in where printing happens. So prior to the Reformation, the most printing per capita was in southern Germany and northern Italy. After the Reformation, it rapidly shifts to Protestant areas, to Switzerland, to the Netherlands, to England, to Sweden, areas that had been cultural backwaters prior to that. You can see that in terms of where you have religious monopolies. So religious competition spurred printing for everybody. But if you look at a Protestant religious theocracy like Geneva, or Puritan England, or Puritan New England, you get tons of printing and tons of newspapers. If you look at the Papal States, you don't. Very little printing, no newspapers until very late, very, very low literacy. And it's also reversible. So after the Reformation, Protestantism spread to Central Europe. Then they were defeated militarily. When you get the spread of Protestantism, you get an increase in printing, an increase in the vernacular. When you get a return to Catholicism, you get a decrease in printing and a decrease in the vernacular. I talked about Orthodox. The one place where you get vernacular printing and broader printing is Romania, where they're competing with Protestants. Not elsewhere. Okay? For Orthodox, it gets frozen in the language of first translation. Now, so there are multiple outcomes of this in Europe. One of them is there's more use of vernacular. Two is there's greater survival of minority languages. So if you think of the Celtic languages of Europe, Welsh, Irish, Breton, and Gaelic, the Bible was translated early into Welsh, and there's all these revivals that used Welsh language for hymns and tracts and Bibles. The Welsh language thrives through the 19th century into the 20th century and dies off with secularization. The Irish language, where there's many more speakers at the beginning of the 19th century, died out in the 19th century and had to be reintroduced politically in the 20th century because Protestants used it to translate the Bible and try to educate people, and so the Catholic Church resisted and used English, and it died out. We see a difference in mass education. The places in the 1600s and 1700s that had close to universal male literacy and high female literacy were all Protestant. We see it in the public-facing libraries. So libraries that are open to the public, libraries that travel, where they're trying to get people to read. We see that in the earlier industrialization of book publishing, pioneered by the tract societies and the Bible societies. And we see it with the rise and spread of newspapers. This seems less intuitively linked to the Bible, but I'll try and demonstrate you this all around the world. So, when Luther tried to spread his ideas, he made a bunch of pamphlets. They're called Flugschriften. They came out very, very regularly. They were very short, they're very cheap, and they sold like hotcakes. So even Catholic printers printed them because they made so much money. It created a reaction where Catholics had to print some too, but most of them were Protestant. But you can see they also made sort of like a form. You could see this is a Flugschriften. It created this sort of desire for short printed matter that came out regularly and that had some type of news content, and then you have this concern when you're getting wars of what's happening with Protestants here and there because you're getting the battles and who's winning and who's losing. And so the desire for international news created this need, and so you get the first printed newspaper, and you can see they're copying the form of a Flugschriften. It was started in Strasbourg, which was a predominantly Protestant area, and newspapers, printed newspapers, spread to northern Germany, to the UK, and to the Netherlands, to places, Protestant areas. There were some earlier handwritten newspapers in Italy and the Habsburg Empire, but they were handwritten, so they're extremely, extremely expensive, only for the elite, and they continue to be handwritten, not printed. And then in Catholic societies like France and Belgium, you got one national newspaper that was controlled by the government, as opposed to multiple competing newspapers. We see a similar pattern when we look at the settler colonies. So the first printing was in South America, in Mexico, but before Protestants arrived in North America. But when Protestants arrive in North America, you get much broader printing and you get a lot of newspapers. So by the time you're the first government gazette anywhere in Latin America, which was in Mexico, printed in 1741, so it was controlled by the government. By that time, you'd already had 10 newspapers in Boston alone, and there were 5 competing newspapers in 1741. Okay, so you can see this difference. And it wasn't a bigger city than Mexico City. We also see a difference between North and South and Southern states. So the northern states were settled for religious reasons, the southern states for economic reasons. Far more literacy, far more printing, far more newspapers in the north. Now, I then use missions as a natural experiment. So lots of people say, oh, it's not really religion, it's something else. Britishness or whatever, I don't know, something. So what we do is you look at where do you get the spread of printing and newspapers around the world. Because lots of people came from Europe to other countries, business people, colonizers, settlers, Catholic missionaries, Protestant missionaries. Where do you get the spread of printing and newspapers and the shift in how language is used? Now, I'm going to do this in 3 broad categories. Areas of the world that had no written language, and I'll look at 3 different groups: Pacific, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas. There were some written languages in those places, but they disappeared quickly. Where there was no written language, where there was written language but no printing. So the Hindu world, the Theravada Buddhist world, and the Muslim world. And then areas where you had printing before Europe, so East Asia and Central Asia. So areas where there's no written language, there's no need to compete with a written form. So who are the people who create written languages, who introduce printing, who introduce newspapers, and who spread mass literacy? If we look at the Pacific, Catholic missionaries arrived in Guam in 1668. At the time, there were about 90,000 inhabitants. Protestant missionaries were kept out, and they didn't arrive until 1900. 8 years later, they printed a portion of the Bible in the Chamorro language. They were the first to print in the Chamorro language 8 years after they arrived, and 240 years after Catholic missionaries arrived, even though most of the population was Catholic. Conversely, when Protestant missionaries arrived in Tahiti, their first mission in the Pacific, in 1797, 13 years later, they were printing part of the Bible. They were printing the Bible in Tahitian, and 17 years later, they were printing it in Tahiti. Even if they arrived at very small places like Aniutiam, which had about 4,000 people when they arrived, they brought a printing press with them and printed the first year. So in the entire Pacific, there are 3 islands where Catholics printed before Protestants. All of them, the French military kept Protestant missionaries out, and all of them printing was very short. But 3 islands in the entire Pacific. And there was an explosion of literacy in Polynesia. So by the mid-19th century, the majority of people in Polynesia were literate. A lot of that was spread by Polynesians, not missionaries, but they were Protestant. Conversely, in the Ottoman Empire, about 2% of people were literate. Okay? That shows you a big difference. It wasn't that the Polynesians were wealthier or had more technological development. You also see a pattern in terms of education. So in the 1930s, 2/3 of the missionaries in the Pacific were Catholic. 2/3 of the students were at Protestant mission schools. So there's a different attitude Similar with newspapers. Protestants created the first newspaper in the Pacific, in Tahiti, in 1826. By 1850, there were newspapers in all the major island groups in the Pacific, Protestant newspapers, before the first Catholic newspaper started in 1852 in Hawaii. So in the 19th century, there were 41 Maori language newspapers, and in Morocco, there was one, printed by Lebanese Christians. We see a similar pattern in Africa. I'll skip it for now. We see a similar pattern in the Americas. Again, even though Catholic missionaries arrived first, they printed in 4 indigenous languages before Protestants did. The vast majority of the indigenous languages were given their written form and printed in by Protestant missionaries in the 20th century. Now, I'm not trying to pick on Catholics. They did lots of other things that are great. They introduced art, they introduced rituals, they introduced scientific stuff throughout the world. But they didn't introduce printing. It was not part of their thinking of how to do things. And they also weren't worse than other religious groups. They just were normal. So wherever Muslims went, they replaced the scripts that were there and replaced them with the Arabic script, and often replaced the language. In China, Southeast Asia, they didn't make minority languages either. Protestant missionaries did that. So the second context is areas that had a written language before missionaries arrived, but did not print. And so we're looking for several indicators of changing in how people think. One of those is printing. Who introduced printing, or difference between Protestant Catholics and others, but and when they print, do they use the local script? Do they introduce newspapers? Who spurs local people to start to print and start to do newspapers? Is there a shift in writing towards the spoken language? So even before printing, you had these elite languages that people used that people didn't speak in. And that was a very new idea. The shift from poetry to prose, mass education, introducing word spacing and punctuation into writing to make it easier for ordinary people to read. Regularizing spelling, and introducing a prose novel. We were not going to talk about all of these, I believe, obviously. But you have the same pattern at the same time, and they're linked with Protestant missionaries. So let's look at Southeast Asia. They had plenty of early exposure to printing, including in Europe, and they had paper. I'm going to be quick, though. So if we look at Theravada Buddhist societies, 3 of them had early printing and early newspapers, and 2 of them had late. This had nothing to do with when they were colonized or whether they were colonized. Thailand was never colonized. It's not related to when Catholic missionaries arrived. It's closely related to when Protestant missionaries arrived. And you can see it when you follow the history. So for example, if we look at Thailand or Siam, Catholic missionaries arrived in 1554. Protestant missionaries arrived in 1833, 279 years later. But Protestant missionaries were the first to print using Thai font, the first to print in Thailand using Thai font. They printed the first government decree. They printed the first 10 newspapers in Thailand. They printed most secular material in Thailand in the 19th century because some missionaries, their mission board left, and so then they supported themselves by printing. If we look at the British colonies of Sri Lanka and Myanmar, again, Catholic missionaries arrived first. Portuguese colonization arrived earlier. Protestant missionaries introduced the first newspapers and printing, and they're the ones who induced other people to print. However, if we looked at Cambodia and Laos, Protestants were again the first to print in those languages, but they did it outside the country and had a hard time getting it in. So the French government was the first to print in those local languages, mostly Buddhist texts, to try and prevent Laotians and Cambodians from reading things being printed in Thailand, to try and create this distinction, and using different scripts to try and create that border. But wherever Protestant missionaries arrived in the 19th century, you get printing in newspapers in the 19th century, and where you didn't, you get printing in newspapers in the 20th century. We see a similar pattern in the Hindu world, which is much broader than India. And India isn't just one place. It was very historically complex, lots of different kingdoms, any of which could have printed. However, Protestant missionaries introduced printing in the vast majority of languages of India. Catholic missionaries arrived in 1556. No, sorry, arrived earlier. They started printing in India in 1556, and some of them were in Tamil, some of them used Latin script, and some of them used Tamil script. So there was some of it there, but in the next 265 years, they printed a grand total of 37 books. Okay? Nobody copied them. The technology was there, the fonts were there, but nobody copied them because there wasn't this sort of trying to convert people with this text. Whereas when Protestant missionaries arrived, it created change. Quite quickly, indigenous people from India started to print in response to them. The first newspaper in a vernacular language was printed in 1818 by Baptist missionaries. It spurred the first two Indian newspapers. The first Catholic newspaper in an Indian language was in 1887, so 69 years later. We see a similar pattern in Sri Lanka, among Hindus in Sri Lanka. So they're using the Tamil language. Protestant missionaries introduced the first printing and the first newspaper. The first newspaper by a non-Protestant was by a man named Arumuga Navalar, who became, quote-unquote, the father of modern Tamil, both in India and in Sri Lanka. He was a graduate of the mission school, taught at the mission school, helped translate the Bible into Tamil. But then when they allowed low-caste students into the mission school, he reacted against that and then started printing anti-missionary tracts and opened an alternative school that only was open to high-caste Hindus. In Nepal, you never was colonized and never were missionaries, so most of the printing developed outside of Nepal. But the earliest Nepali person to print was a Protestant convert. He also had the first Nepali newspaper. And missionaries were kept out of Nepal until 1951. When they arrived, 2% of Nepalis were literate. We see a similar pattern in Bali. You have early colonization, early exposure to Europeans and Chinese, and a very broad literature. But missionaries were kept out. You don't get printing until after 1949. If we look at the Muslim world, we can divide it into four types of societies. Areas where Protestant missionaries were allowed but could not convert Muslims. Areas where they were allowed and could convert Muslims. Areas where they were not allowed at all. And then areas where there was large numbers of Christians prior to missionaries arriving. And the first type, where they allowed but not to convert. One example of this is Iran. So a missionary named Henry Martin, who was in India, was translating the Bible into Persian. He went to Persia for a year to try and perfect his translation. And he shared it with lots of people, including Abbas Mirza. Then he tried to go back to England to print it, but he died along the way. So it was printed in 1815 in the Russian Bible Society and 1816 in the British and Foreign Bible Society. Abbas Mirza sent Iranians to the Russian Bible Society and the British and Foreign Bible Society, where they worked for a while, helping them translate things like tracts, and then were given fonts and printing presses, came back. They were the first people to print in Iran. So the link is very, very, very clear. However, Abbas Mirza died, and they couldn't convert Muslims, and it was more restrictive after Abbas Mirza died. And so printing expands very, very slowly. Conversely, in places like India, they were allowed and can convert Muslims. So printing explodes. So by 1850, there are more than 1,000 titles printed by Muslims in India. And by 1867, Muslims in most cities and towns of India were printing. And they started to export Muslim texts to Muslims all around the Muslim world from India, which had never been a sort of sending area for Muslims. We see a similar pattern in Singapore and Southeast Asia. The first Muslim to print worked at the missionary press. And many of the early printers were trained by Benjamin Peach Keysbury, a missionary. But they start exporting texts from Singapore all over the Muslim world. Conversely, a place where you would think there would be printing, like Mecca and Medina, it's very late. Missionaries were kept out. So the first printing in Mecca was in 1883. The first printing in Medina was in 1885. Long after you're getting printing in Palembang and Zanzibar and all these places that aren't centers of millions of people coming every year for the Hajj and large groups of Muslim scholars writing people all over the Muslim world. Now, the fourth place is an area where they have large Christian populations like Lebanon and Egypt. People who worked with the missionaries became crucial in the rise of Fusha, the modern standard Arabic, the type of Arabic that people write in now, which is not the same as Quranic Arabic, although it's not what people speak. So people like Boutros el-Bustani and Faris el-Sadiqia and others. You also get the rise of newspapers in Lebanon and Egypt, and they become the centers of media for the entire Muslim world. But the link with missions is very close. So in Egypt, of the first 21 newspapers that were printed, 18 of them were printed by Christians, most of whom were graduates of mission schools. So it's very, very, very clear. Now there are two exceptions that people talk about. One of them is Mutafariqa in Ottoman Turkey, who printed in the 1700s. He was a Hungarian from Cluj, Protestant, who converted to Islam. And he printed, but nobody copied him for a long time. The other is Muhammad Ali in Egypt, who in 1815 sent a Christian Maronite to Europe to learn how to print under the advice of an Armenian. And it was at the time when Protestant missionaries were exporting lots of Arabic Bibles into the Eastern Mediterranean. I just haven't proved that spurred anything. I just know it was happening, but I don't know if it spurred anything. No one's written about that. And the records got burned, so it's hard to know. Context 3, where you had printing before Europe in East Asia and Central Asia. And so here, we're not looking for the introducing of printing, we're looking for a shift in how people use printing. So missionaries were important in making movable font type efficient. So East Asians had movable font type before Europe, including metal movable font type. So the missionaries were not bringing something new in terms of that. But what they did do is they perfected the technique for making them that was much more efficient, although some of that is just technology growth. But they also created an organizational system. So they counted how often the characters are used in texts to figure out the frequency, and then made an organization system so someone could sit in one place and get all the most frequent characters and sped up compositing much more quickly rather than having a room where someone had to walk around, which is the system before. So previously, movable font type was used only like by the imperial household when they're trying to print small numbers of texts, like if you're going to print 20 or 40 or 50, or for making genealogies, where there's a lot of repeated words. Writing moving towards spoken language. So the modern version of what we call Mandarin, or Baihua, was codified in the 1920s and 30s, following patterns that missionaries had pioneered in how to translate the Bible. Okay? That was not how people wrote. It's a new thing. Similarly, the modern Korean writing develops in the 1920s. Popularizing phonetic scripts. So one example of this we can look at is with Korea. So in 1444, King Sejong invented a wonderful writing system for Korean language. It was mostly used, though, it was not widely used because Confucian scholars didn't like it. They thought it was too easy, so they called it women's language. And so it was not widely used and almost never printed until the 19th century. Protestant missionaries popularized using what's now called Hangul. It was not called that then, in terms of to write the Bible and other hymns and tracts so that ordinary people could use it. And then it creates a shift in terms of they're trying to regularize spelling for using the Bible. So Korean Christians and missionaries together decided on a spelling system, adding word spacing and punctuation, creating an alphabetical order, etc. And then you have this process of reform in terms of how Hangul is written, mostly in the early 20th century. And it's first the missionaries and their Koreans, then Japanese impose a system that combines the missionary system with reforms proposed by a guy named James Gale, a missionary. And then later on, the students of Chu Shi Gyong and others who had worked at the missionary press create the final version of how people now write Hangul. Spread of mass education, the spread of newspapers, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The idea of freedom of press are the first people to advocate that. And the introduction of public-facing libraries. So the libraries existed, they just weren't public-facing. So if we look at newspapers, so China for a long time had a government gazette. It was produced by the government to tell government regulations to people, to high government officials. But Protestant missionaries introduced the first newspaper in the Chinese language. In fact, the first newspaper in East Asia. The first newspaper printed in China. Before 1890, 95% of the periodicals printed in China were printed by Protestant missionaries. And as late as 1898, the newspaper with the widest circulation in China was produced by Protestant missionaries. The early Chinese people who produced missionaries all were directly linked to these missionary things, so people like Wang Tao, etc. If we look at Tibet, they had printing before Europe. The first secular text was printed by Protestant missionaries. The first newspaper was printed in 1904 by a Moravian missionary. And the first Tibetan to print a newspaper was by a Moravian convert in 1925. The first non-Christian newspaper by Tibet was printed in the 1950s by the government in exile, so it was a gazette. If we look at libraries, public-facing libraries, libraries existed, but they were for the imperial court or they're for families to help them do better on the Confucian exam system, etc. So they were inward-facing. Not anyone could go. And you can see this in the words that was historically used for libraries, which is 藏书楼, book storage building. Missionaries pioneered the term 图书馆, picture book pavilion, which is open. People can come. They had the first libraries that were open to the public, not just the family and the imperial household. The first libraries where you could borrow books. They created, and their students, the first systematic cataloging system. The first library outreach programs to get people to use the library. And the first libraries with open stacks where you could walk among the books. And they taught library science at Boone College, which was a missionary college, which is now Wuhan University, and which is still the best university library science program in China, is at Wuhan University, which was started by Protestant missionaries. So I don't want to pick on anyone, but missionaries didn't just spread a technology. They spread an idea that transformed how that technology was used. As it diffused, as that idea diffused, now we think it is normal. And there's not religious differences, and we don't think of it as being a religious idea, but it was a religious idea. Now we think it's normal that women and poor people should read. That is not normal historically. Now we think it's normal that writing should be accessible, close enough to your spoken language that ordinary people can understand it. They don't have to learn a new language in order to learn how to read. We think that's normal. It wasn't. And we also think a lot of these changes are inevitable. It's just, quote unquote, modernity. And so then like Hangul, of course, this beautiful system was created, and of course it would take over in the end. It didn't have to, and it didn't prior to missionaries pioneering it. And Japanese actually tried to create a combination of system like Japanese is written now with Hanbon, or kanji, Chinese characters, with that have Hangul to sort of do grammatical features that are not in Chinese, because they thought it would restrict Western influence and allow them to have greater access and greater control. So I hope I've convinced you that religion was crucial to the origin, spread, uses, economic viability, and consequences of printing. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions, so if you could raise your hand, I'll get the mic to you. We want to get a good copy of questions and answers. Thank you.
Oh, I didn't have my mic on.
You mentioned the innovations in making printing more efficient.
Yes.
But could you give us some more examples? You didn't quite go to any.
Okay, so
Where you see that in various places.
okay, I'll do in China where they had printing. So a missionary named William Gamble developed a technique using electroplating. So you would carve bamboo sticks, and then you would run a charge through water with metal in it, and it would cling to the thing, and you could make a very, very fine character, much more fine than people could do when they had to carve them. And then you would stamp that, and it became the dominant form of making characters throughout East Asia. And so the first people who it was called the secular press, but two people who worked at that mission press bought some of the equipment from the mission press and opened the first sort of major private publishing house in China that used movable font type and used this technique. He then went to Japan and trained people how to use that technique, and it became the dominant version of how printing was done in Japan. And the first Japanese daily, the first Japanese newspaper was made by a fisherman who was a Christian convert. But the first daily used the movable font from William Gamble. And then the numbering system for fonts, at least in Japan, I don't know about in China, but in Japan, that system comes from the advertising brochure from William Gamble's, when he was selling fonts. So you had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and those sizes are still in Japan. And his Ming font is like Times New Roman. Yeah.
More questions?
Thank you. Did the major universities in Europe, Paris, Prague, Bologna, Oxford, did they play much of a role in pushing printing, or did they just kind of become a repository for things that were printed?
I'm not an expert on European university printing, so I don't know that for sure. I do know that in England, only Cambridge and Oxford could print the Bible. They had a monopoly. So the British and Foreign Bible Society had to do it in cooperation with the universities. But the first steam press was done by the Times of England, but the first 5 after that were bought by the Bible Society. The first steam press in the United States was bought by the American Bible Society. They pioneered the use of what's called stereotyping. So movable font type to hold it is very expensive because each font is very expensive. So then they would print in plaster and then pour lead into that, and then they could reuse that page. That technique was probably first invented by the Constantine Bible Society in Germany. The person who's normally given credit for it is a guy named Stanhope in England. But it was used initially for religious material. And the biggest customers for that technology were the Bible Society in the US and in England, and the tract societies. So they made it profitable.
And thanks, Bob. It was a great
wanted you to pick up on a thread that you mentioned right at the end, namely the idea of inevitable progress.
Yeah.
It's such a strong cultural narrative. Of course, literacy exploded, et cetera, et cetera. It was inevitable that
Yeah.
Protestant sensibilities were
That's
part
right.
of the tide of what would have happened anyway.
Right.
Can you address that some more?
I just think what you said is true. So people, okay, because currently there's not religious differences in printing or the idea that everyone should read, etc., we don't think about the origin. We just think it's normal. And then we think what we are is modern, and that was sort of inevitable, and technology led to that inevitable thing. And then we think, oh, of course, that will happen everywhere, and then that gets applied to secularization and all kinds of other things. Like, that happened in Europe, so that's where everyone else is going to go. But it's just, I think it's at the level of just sort of subconscious. Because we think, oh, I'm smart, I'm modern, I'm the, whatever. And we don't know history, and we tend to censor religion from history a lot, and so then people don't realize that it was a religious idea.
May I ask a follow-up?
Absolutely, please.
Are there case studies of as societies become more secular, print publications diminish, literacy rates diminish, or some of the fruits of printing fall away?
I don't know any. I haven't studied it, and I don't know. I don't think that's necessarily a necessary thing. So it's like if you look at Japan now, not many people are Protestant. There's some, but there's lots of printing. You don't have to be Protestant now. It's just like the market has taken over and an idea has diffused, and now people just think it's normal. What I think is, what I'm focusing on is, where did that idea come from? Because it clearly wasn't technology that caused that outcome. It facilitated the outcome.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Woodberry, for that. That was really information-packed talk. I really appreciate it.
Maybe too much.
So I did some work on Christian publishing myself,
Mhm.
and in modern Africa, so West Africa in particular, the Sudan Interior Mission
Uh-huh.
was one of the most productive printing missionary organizations in the post-war era.
Yeah.
And so one of their magazines, African Challenge, which was based in Nigeria,
Mhm.
was for a time the leading periodical on the whole continent.
Mhm.
Right? And so there's a South African publication called Drone that actually met with those editors to get tips on how to actually make their magazine.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so.
I would love to read that.
Yeah. And so I'm just wondering, some of this seems, especially with your information and the evidence that you have, it seems inarguable that there is a connection between Protestantism and printing
Right.
and literacy.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, what are the main pushbacks you've gotten, either on this particular theme of your research or over the past 10, 15 years since
Right.
the first Missionary Roots of Liberal Democracy?
Yeah. This article I've only done in presentations. I haven't published. I haven't gotten any coherent arguments. I've had someone yell at me for the entire rest of the session until everybody left. But his point was, well, Muslims had mass communication technology because they used wayang puppets in Indonesia. And I said, I'm talking about printing. And, well, why do you always say good things about missionaries? Why don't you say bad things about missionaries? It's not an argument against this. And I presented at quite a few conferences. We'll see when I get publishing what the pushback is. The same thing on my Missionary Roots of Liberal Democracy article. I used to get yelled at a lot. trying to get that thing published, let's just say it was many years of not people critiquing anything I said, but just asking for more, or just rejecting it without giving me a reason. Afterwards, it's done pretty well. It's gotten a lot of awards, and a lot of, particularly economists, do research on it, and they find similar results. But one story that sticks with me, it won, one year at the American Political Science Review, it won like 4 different awards, including the Best Article in Comparative Politics, which is the largest section in the APSA. And they had like a reception with like food, and someone came to the reception who hadn't been to the award ceremony and asked me, "Oh, what was your paper about?" And I told him, and he said, "What's your religious background?" And I said, "I'm a Christian." And he said, "Well, there we have it," and walked away. And I was like, "Oh, okay, I guess you just disproved my whole argument. Thank you." But, you know, I don't know. There's a lot of evidence. For me, what's crazy is why people haven't done this before. Okay, like even just on a smaller scale. This started from me, you know, when I was doing the background research for that article and seeing this relationship with printing, and then just seeing, okay, how far can I drive this argument? And it just kept on going and going and going and going and going. I was just like, wow, I can't get this. It never stops. And then I thought, like, well, it sounds a little triumphalistic Protestant. I should probably include some other religious groups in there too. And I also found all these interesting patterns with Buddhism, and one, the rise of printing that people are reading, but also like printing texts on clay, but then also like nobody copies them. Literally, I mean, there are millions of Muslims in China. They are surrounded by people who are printing. They could have printed, they didn't. Why is that? It didn't have a religious function for them. You can memorize the Quran, it's short and poetic, and there were other ways of making merit, is what I would argue, but I don't know. I mean, Catholics, there's 2 cases of Catholics spurring others to print. One of them is Muslims in China. So in the 1600s, when the Jesuits come and take over the calendar, the Muslim astronomers had run the calendar for the Chinese, and then the Jesuits took it over, and there's this like big pushback. And in that context, they start printing things against Catholics, but also trying to increase their knowledge of Arab science and Arab religious texts, and they start printing. But that's in the 1600s. Yeah. She had her hand up.
Oh, thank you.
I'm still formulating my thought here.
Totally fine.
Thank you so much for this talk. This is fascinating. So I was thinking about the Asian context.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And it seems like the timeline is, so I could see a lot of scholars make the case that the timeline that you're presenting, Protestants are also coming at a time when the countries are being opened.
Yes.
So it's associated with the global spread of capitalism.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
it could largely be also associated with westernization.
Yep.
And complicating things, I would imagine, are some of the intellectuals that I'm thinking of who wanted to westernize
Mm-hmm.
for the sake of surviving within this new global capitalism.
Yeah.
And they were working with missionaries, but not necessarily for religious reasons,
Right.
but to westernize, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
So, in your project, I was wondering how you make the distinction between because there seems to be a close alignment with, but there might be some need to distinguish between westernization and Christianization.
Sure,
right?
sure.
And how you're associating some of these developments that are happening here that, like scholars in my field, often associate with westernization, which
Yeah.
is the spread of vernacular language, public-facing libraries, newspapers, all of these things.
Yes.
How's it religious, right? Rather
Right.
than Western.
Right. I make the argument, well, one, you have the same pattern all over. And two, these close links with Protestant missionaries, not Catholic missionaries, not other Europeans, Protestant missionaries. So for example, in the case of Korea, forgive me, I will murder people's names because I don't know Korean. And I will forget many of them too because I do the world. But Sochepil worked with Appenzeller, Henry Appenzeller, and the Independent he printed that while he was working as a teacher at the Methodist Mission School, which was the first newspaper printed with Hangul characters. The first 3 newspapers were all by people at that institution. And then when he was forced to leave Korea, the mission continued to print the Independent after he left. When you're looking at, so there's this very clear link. They could have worked lots of places. They all worked with one missionary at one institution. When we're looking at sort of the reform of Hangul, the writing system, so it was updated in the 19th and early 20th century to account for change in language. There were things that were no longer pronounced, particularly in the Seoul dialect. And the earlier missionary ones were partially based more on a more northern dialect, which didn't match Seoul, but also, well, originally they were just trying to be phonetic. And so a team of Koreans and missionaries came up with a spelling system and introduced, for the first time, word spacing. And there were some grammatical features, but they add more punctuation. Then, James Gale has a more radical version, and there's this whole debate within the missionary magazines about how to reform Hangul and make it fit better and work better, because there's some things that are confusing, etc. And Gale has this more radical proposal, but the missionaries decide not to go with it because they're worried about offending Koreans. But then when the Japanese take over, they impose a combination of the system used with the Bible and Gale's reforms. And that becomes what the Japanese impose for the standard for Hangul, the first official version of Hangul. Now they also push the combination with Chinese characters and eventually push Japanese. Then the people who create the ultimate system, which is based more on morphemes, like differentiating the meaning of things, not just the sound, based on historical origin. Chu Si-jung and his students. Okay, Chu Si-jung also worked with Appenzeller at the press and was a close friend with Gale, James Gale. So, even though that system differed from the missionary system and eventually won out, I don't know, it seems odd that he's working with exactly the same people and his students. And then a high proportion of them were Protestant, when there was very few Protestants in Korea. Then later on, Seungman-rhee, when he comes to power, he tries to not have that system. He tries to go back to the old missionary one from the Bible, which is more phonetic-based and less complicated, he thinks. Well, that's because he knows it. He studied also with Appenzeller. So, but he doesn't win out. It creates a big reaction, because at that time it's associated with the Japanese. And so it just seems odd, if it's just modernity, that all these people who are involved interact very closely with the same, not just missionaries, like 2 or 3 missionaries. It's pretty, I don't know. And then when you can do that all over the world, where the timing of some of these things is quite different, the weight of the repetition, an argument that you don't have to adjust to location is stronger than one that you have to keep on changing for every place. So that's what I would argue.
I think we have time for one more question. Dr. Hampson.
Well, I I'm not sure that I should be the one to ask the last question. So anyway, thank you so much for your extraordinary work and this presentation this evening. My question really is one about culture. So I would like you to flesh out a little bit more about and contrast Catholic missionaries and Protestant missionaries, and because it was clear they had a very different impact on printing. So
Yeah.
would you just say something about contrasting Catholics and Protestants?
Well, first of all, Catholic missionaries change a lot over time. So if you're talking about Catholic missionaries now, they're not different in terms of printing, and they're being quite sensitive. But in the prior to at least World War II, the changes started in the 1920s, but culminate in Vatican II. There are several things that reduce the role of printing. One, the centrality of Latin and the Latin alphabet, a writing system. So where Catholic missionaries go, they sometimes print, but it's mostly for either Eastern Christians or clergy to train them to do confession or other things with people if they don't know the language very well. They typically use Latin script. And so, for example, when the Spanish invade Latin America, there are some writing systems that existed. They destroyed those. They tried to burn the texts that were in those languages. They printed some in Nahuatl, but using the Latin alphabet, and that didn't last very long. Then they also printed in the imperial languages of Quechua and Aymara. The one group that was doing a smaller non-imperial language was the Jesuits that printed in Guarani. But then secularizing Marquis de Pombal, one, kicked them out, but also banned all printing in Portuguese colonies to weaken the power of the Catholic Church. So they do some printing, it's just not a lot, and it tends to be in Latin script, and it's mostly internally focused. There's another thing that happens, there also becomes much more worry about doctrine. So they want everything to have an imprimatur, so it has to be sent back to a bishop to approve, and then eventually back to the Vatican. So then they try to centralize things at the Propaganda Fide, and they have an amazing number of fonts that they could produce there quite early. But it just slows down the production of text, and then also the printing is mostly not happening locally. Some of it is, but very little. And so people are not being trained at a press. Whereas because Protestants are bringing presses with them, and they're just printing willy-nilly and huge numbers of text and trying to convert people with them, and just like literally tens of thousands of texts. And it creates this reaction, but then there's also all these people who are working at the missionary press who learn how to do it. And then they say, oh, I can do this, and so then they go off and make their own press. And then they had wood press, and then they sell and get a metal press, and then the people buy the wooden press and start their printing or whatever, and that's just how it happened. Whereas Catholics, it just didn't happen that way. Yeah.
Hey folks, I'll take the moderator's privilege of asking the last question. So thank you for that. So as we approach the year 2000, CNN ran a story on what were the top, 1,000 technological inventions. We all know what number one was, right?
Printing.
The printing press. But the question I have for you isn't about Johannes Gutenberg per se. It's about his religious faith. Mm-hmm. Was he a Protestant? Was he a Catholic?
No. This was before Protestantism. So he was in 1450. Circa 1450 is when he starts to print. 1450.
But he was a believer.
He was a Christian, but there was no Protestants at that time. His earliest printing was Psalms, and then the Bible, and then indulgences. And the fact of printing indulgences, it was so profitable. But that really drove the expansion of indulgences because printers are like, wow, we can print one page and like sell it. We don't have to print this huge book and have all this invested of cash, which we don't get our money back until people buy our books. You just do one page, and the Catholic Church would buy, 10,000. Great. Get them off. And they were making lots of money. And that's what led to this huge increase in indulgences, which ticked off Luther.
Luther, that was one of the reasons we got it.
Yeah, so...
Well, thank you so much for coming back to Wheaton College. Let's give him a big hand.